So my talk today will begin with written exposition of the background and a more freestyle discussion of very specific passages from two texts of Bergman's and Scholem's. Zionism has been a contested term since it was first coined. That it continues to be fraught with tensions more than 7 decades after the founding of the State of Israel is testimony to its instability. Theological reflections on Zionism have also yielded different ideas to the extreme. In order to reckon with the acuteness of the challenge, one need only be reminded of David Ben-Gurion's vision of Israel as recreating the Hebraic polity of the biblical era, of Avraham Cohen Cook's mystical interpretation of Jews' mundane existence in the Holy Land, or ultra-Orthodox teachings that range from radical negation to celebration of the State of Israel. Political theologies of Zionism, that is, Zionist political agendas fleshed out within a theological framework and relying on theological vocabularies, do tend to share one feature: the assumption of seamless continuity between the theological and the political. Hence, events, decisions, and consequences will have a corresponding theological explanation, and theological concepts will have a political correlate exemplifying them. To establish the ground zero of my discussion, I propose to think of Zionism as a political idea with many shades of possibilities regarding its implementation, formulated as follows: Jews living in Zion as their national home. What territory is covered by the term Zion? What is the legal and constitutional nature of this national home? What are the ideals that shape this idea, and how is it to be implemented? Almost any answer will qualify as Zionist. An abiding characteristic of Zionism has been the attraction to theological terminology. And so even a political leader like Menachem Osishkin, chairman of the Jewish National Fund, Kakal, could be found uttering a statement like the following, and I quote, "I must wholeheartedly admit that I'm not fond of the expression Zionism, inasmuch as I was not fond of the formulation love of Zion, Chibat Zion. Zionism dates back 40 years, and love of Zion precedes it by 30 years, perhaps. But our movement is a redemptive movement, and it dates back 2,000 years, to the day our temple was destroyed and our people was exiled from its land. If we use the formulation redemption, Geulah, this is a grand and complete idea, and no dent to its territory, be it giving up Jerusalem and Zion altogether, will vanquish it," end quote. Making this rather surprising assertion before an audience of educators shortly before his death in 1941, Osishkin placed trust in a concept that in his eyes proved durability far exceeding that of political factions or ideological movements. Although it is of an historical nature more than a divine one, Osishkin's notion of redemption transcends time and contingencies, yet guides the very concrete step of purchasing tracts of land and inhabiting them with committed pioneers. And thus, without mentioning divine involvement, the term provides thrust to a work plan for giving shape and substance to the expansion of Jewish territorial presence in Palestine. The intellectual circle known as Brit Shalom offers an interesting exception to this affinity for theological terminology. Founded in 1925 and dissolved in 1933, the group, founded by Arthur Rupin and later on taken over by its so-called radical faction, advocated the founding of a binational polity in Palestine as the only escape from an ethical and political catastrophe. Hugo Bergman, born in 1883 and died in 1975, and Gershom Scholem, who was born in 1897 and died in 1982, the undeclared leaders of this radical faction, purposefully and systematically concentrated on the pragmatics of the political reality they sought to change. Despite being world-class thinkers, with well-developed, well-argued theological agendas, as politically responsible members of society, Bergman and Scholem were adamant that concrete political action should be separated from theological considerations. Thanks to their joint activism, the two thinkers developed a common and enduring political agenda. In my talk today, I would like to present the initial fruits of a new research project, which focuses on texts presenting Bergman's and Scholem's theological programs in a political context, late in their lives, in the aftermath of the founding of the State of Israel. Bergman's Heaven and Earth, Hashamayim ve'aretz, Meditations on Human Responsibility, published in Hebrew in 1968, and Scholem's Nihilism as a Religious Phenomenon, published in German in 1974. Neither text is defined by its author as a political theology or as an attempt to establish a thesis in this vein. Neither posits Zionism as its object of reflection, and neither text purports to present a fully fledged program of whatever sort. And yet, these late studies by Bergman and Scholem provide precious glimpses into the theological, perhaps also metaphysical undergirding of their outspoken political views. Given the common political ground that Bergman and Scholem shared, the suggestion to think of the above-mentioned text as political theologies of Zionism is too tempting to give up. The decisive step that marked the ascendancy of the radical faction of Brit Shalom was the launch of a Hebrew quarterly, Shifotenu, literally our aspirations, which quickly became the group's main platform for presenting its views and plans. Replying to one of its many critics, Yehuda Burla, Scholem made clear that Brit Shalom opposes any confusion of terms between the theological and the political, and I quote, "How is political redemption possible? Is Burla referring to the messianic idea in political form? If so, I must openly say that this question should not be addressed specifically to Brit Shalom, but to the Zionist movement as a whole. As a member of Brit Shalom, like thousands of other Zionists who do not belong to the group and hold vastly remote opinions, I oppose the blurring and mixing of political terms. The redemption of the people of Israel that I aspire to as a Zionist is not identical whatsoever with the religious redemption that I hope will arrive in time to come," end quote. Scholem's programmatic essay hedges the risk entailed by the freewheeling employment of theological rhetoric in the service of pragmatic plans. Sishkin's land purchases or Burla's accusations against Brit Shalom's supposed rejection of Zionist tenets, the legal claim to the land of Israel, Jews' political redemption, and vigorous observance of Jewish-Arab partnership, which is actually a concept that is quite close to the agenda of Brit Shalom, claim legitimacy thanks to direct link they discern to a rather amorphous idea of Jewish redemption. For Scholem, and by implication also for Bergman, the religious and the political belong to two distinct ontological orders. The prospects of redeeming the people of Israel from its unfortunate historical predicament depends on contingent circumstances, whereas religious redemption is anything but contingent. It is eternal and absolute. And for the very same reason, it cannot entail contingencies and cannot be anticipated. Hence, the pragmatic conclusions of Brit Shalom regarding the absolute necessity of a binational state for the future of Zionism derive from a matter-of-fact analysis of the political situation. This mindset was expressed consistently in the pages of Shifotenu and Jüdische Rundschau, whose editor-in-chief, Robert Welch, was affiliated with the Bergman-Scholem faction. Nevertheless, it was informed by the conviction that political action does have theological underpinnings. And so, for example, an entry in Bergman's diary from 1934 documents his marvel at Scholem's attempts at formulating his own conception of such a theology. and I quote, "Something beautiful between Gershom's papers. These are sketches of a Jewish theology. I picked up the paper from Scholem's desk, a sketch of the turning of God's face. We are led too quickly to think that we understand the position from which ethical categories are employed. This pertains to a turn of the gaze that does not leave a trace. To use Kafka's words, the landowner did not climb up to a higher floor. He simply left without letting anyone find him. And hence, religion teaches us man finds God," end quote. In his article, Hugo Bergman's Philosophy of Temporality Between Redemption and Brit Shalom, Nitzan Leibovich stresses the crucial bond between Bergman's search for precise theological formulation of his Jewish faith and his political activism. While such a bond certainly exists, it nevertheless leaves a sizable gap between the two realms, that of action in reality and that of engagement with the divine. As Leibovich also notes, Bergman's reflection on the concept of redemption was a lifelong quest. In this sense, he wholly agreed with Scholem that concrete acts of furthering the Zionist cause, even the brand of Zionism they endorsed, by no means should be understood as partaking of divine intervention in order to bring about absolute fulfillment of God's goodness on earth. And now, as I turn to reflect a little bit on the two texts, the two political, theological reflections of Bergman and Scholem, I would like to speak a little bit more freely about what we can take away from those reflections. First of all, there are certain similarities and certain pattern differences between the two texts. The platform that Bergman chose for his text is distinctly Zionist. It's with the publishing house of the journal Shdemot of the kibbutz movement, which by definition is a Zionist platform, whereas Scholem's extended essay was published with the yearbook of the Aranis Circle, which is a Swiss publishing house of a circle of religious scholars of comparative religion from all over the world, basically. And so there is no Zionist or even Israeli context to this platform. And another thing that is actually very similar between the two texts is that the political theological reflections have to be extracted from the subtexts of these two texts with greater effort when it comes to Scholem, but also in Bergman's texts. Many of the insights that I'm now working on have to be teased out between the lines and are not spelled out for us as readers. So the one nugget that I would like to share with you today from Bergman's text pertains to the very act of interpretation, which is at the heart of any political theology. And this assertion that I will quote immediately is made in reference to the binding of Isaac. Bergman tells us as follows: the principle should be, wherever the sanctified version of the text clashes with my moral sentiment, I must sacrifice the text rather than my reason or sentiment. When we are told that God commanded an act opposed to our moral sentiment, we are commanded to respond, God could not have commanded this. Most importantly, the liberty of the individual, the responsibility of the individual as a carrier of rational, ethical reason to examine values of the highest order. And I end quote. This specific quote is at the same time very close and very remote from Scholem's position, from Scholem's own political theology. It is close because it advocates a certain human liberty that we are not accustomed to think in the context of theology. God is not the final arbiter in all cases. There is room for human action and human reflection that Scholem would very much endorse. But on the other hand, there is a certain clarity, ethical clarity, that Scholem doesn't feel at ease formulating himself so explicitly. Moving on to Scholem's text, I would like to quote the very closing sentence, two sentences of a 50-page long essay. And the essay can be read as a historical survey of different religious movements that were based on a nihilist ideology, and are not only Jewish, but also Gnostic and Christian from medieval Christianity. But he ends with a very long discussion of Sabbatianism and Frankism. And the text is just redolent with his critiques of Zionism as a so-called Sabbatian movement. And so the final words in this essay ring very far and very wide away from the Arana Circle and Ascona in Switzerland and back to Israel. And I quote, the central figure of the movement is a dark and in many respects appalling despotic personality who realizes and hypostasizes his wild urges. Followers of this movement, however, possessed true faith, finding redemption in the promise of an anarchic utopia, wherein they rejected rabbinic Judaism. And from now on, the project is to develop clearer links between such statements and Scholem's and Bergman's explicit evaluations of Zionism. Thank you.